We sat down, ready for the next talk here by Angelo, who's going to come up and talk about Bitcoin versus Ethereum. Is that correct, Angelo?
Yes.
Right, okay. And if any of you here are unaware of what Ethereum is, you're in a good place. You don't need to know what it is. It's a complete and utter total waste of your time, and Angelo's going to explain exactly why that is the case. He's also the author of Do Bitcoin, The Future of Money, and What You Need to Know, which is a book he's bought for you guys to dig into. He'll be happy to sign those books for you afterwards. And Angelo works by day for Fast Bitcoins. So without further ado, as
May
he's
as well.
looking for a
Thank you.
bottle of
Yes,
water,
thank you.
please put your hands together for Angelo.
Thank you. I switched it on. Oh, amazing. A good place to start. Can everybody see the image on the screen correctly? Okay, so this is a system that produces mechanical energy in the spinning of the wheel at the bottom. And that's the output of this system. Can anybody tell me what the input is? Water, right, yes, because the water's turning it. But where's the water coming from? It's going in a circle, right? It looks like it's flowing downstream and comes back to there. This obviously wouldn't be possible in reality. You'd be struggling if you tried to build something like this. But as it says at the bottom there, it's just information. You're not looking at an actual photo of a place. All you're being presented with is information that's not tied to the physical world in any real way. And because of that, you're able to see things that don't actually make any sense, and your brain just perceives them as, oh yeah, you can follow the bricks, they're going down, they're going down, they're going down. And hopefully by the end of this talk, I will have convinced you that Ethereum, in its new purely informational, as in it's not tied to the physical world in any sense, it's just using Ethereum in its consensus mechanism, is doing exactly the same thing as you see in this image. Sounds weird now, hopefully it'll make more sense later. I want you to keep in mind this idea, TANSTAAFL, which is kind of a really long abbreviation of a phrase that there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. And this is something that I'm sure, especially as you get older, you realize is true. When you're a kid, you might think that there is, and then you grow up and realize, you know, all the work that went into providing for you as a kid by your parents, and everything that you think is just sort of provided for you has always had work gone into it. It's sort of a fundamental economic principle, and it's kind of the basis of the whole idea of free markets, because to have a free market, you are essentially, well, I guess the purpose of a free market, if you were to look at mankind from a bird's eye perspective, is to effectively manage the distribution of resources throughout all of the people. If you put a bunch of talking monkeys on a floating space rock and there isn't any system in place to manage resources, then you prevent them from being able to specialize. And this is one of the problems that money solved, and we'll get to it in a minute. But the main thing just to keep in mind is that there isn't no such thing as a free lunch. Okay, those are the two premises out of the way. Who am I? I don't know why I put a photo of Batman there. Maybe I hope that you'd think I was double bluffing and secretly am. I'm not. But my name is Angelo. I grew up in southwest Wales. It's a very sleepy village, and when I was quite into parkour when I was younger, and I was at a parkour competition, and messed up a jump, hurt myself pretty bad. Doctors were like, "This might not be good for your survival," basically. So I was like, you know, I've spent. Am I allowed to swear?
Yeah.
All right, cool, great. So I realized, yeah, it's I think when you're that young and you realize that time is finite, you start to look at things a little bit differently. And I think this is sort of what happens in the classic midlife crisis, you know, where somebody grows up and they're quite happy with their life until they get to about halfway and they realize, oh God, time is actually moving, and it, you know, there's no way to slow it down in any way. And so that kind of happened when I was 12, which led me to leave school, because the current education system is a solution to the problem of education, and it has that solution in a very blanket way. So it has to sort of amalgamate all the various personalities of various individuals and try to synthesize an average Joe and like a John Doe type character, and then develop an education system around John Doe. But unfortunately, the average of any set never actually, well, sometimes there's in it in maths, but the average of all people isn't an actual real person. There's nobody who is an exact average person. So it doesn't work for everybody, is essentially what I'm getting to. So I left school, and then about a year after that, I found out about Ethereum first, actually. I tried to understand it, failed, tried again, failed again, realized I probably should understand a bit about Bitcoin before I learn about that. So that was the beginning of my sort of rabbit hole journey into understanding what Bitcoin is. I don't know how long everybody in the audience has been into Bitcoin. I know there's probably quite a wide variety. But if you are just getting into it now, there's probably one of two things that will happen. Either you will find it kind of interesting, have a few conversations with people and never really go into it, or it will get you. And when it gets you, there's no coming back, because you realize that a lot of the preconceived notions that you had about the world that you live in up until that point were completely flown past your head, and you hadn't really spent the time to think about any of them at all. And when you start to realize how the current system and the financial system works, it's kind of like taking off the rose-tinted glasses in a sense. And if you're not careful, you can become a doomer on Twitter, which is why we have Bitcoin Twitter now, which is a lovely place. Not for the faint-hearted, though. So yeah, I think it was about a few years of on and off learning about Bitcoin until I got into Fast Bitcoins, which is a company I work for at the moment, which is a Bitcoin brokerage that's in the kitchen at the moment, sort of cooking out something really cool. But in the meantime, we're just focused on education with the blog and the YouTube channel, where I make Bitcoin explainer videos. And so the whole purpose of that is to try and take the complex topic of Bitcoin and distill it into something that everybody can understand, which is an impossible task, but I feel like if you aim at something impossible, you can get closer to it at least, which is what I'm going to try and do here, although Bitcoin versus Ethereum and talking about the consensus mechanisms of them might not be the easiest way to make a big topic simple, but we'll give it a go. To understand what exactly Bitcoin is running on and what exactly Ethereum is running on, you sort of have to start at the problems that they're both trying to solve, which are very different problems. The problem that Bitcoin was solving when it was created was the money problem, and it's a problem that I briefly mentioned earlier that we've had for ages. If you want all of these talking monkeys to be able to handle resources effectively, you need to be able to have them specialize and get really good at, for instance, fixing cars, because if you didn't have money and you couldn't find somebody who wanted their car fixed, then you wouldn't be able to get any food in return, and you might starve. So I think, I'm not sure if I'm preaching to the choir here, but I'll do a crash course anyway on the history of money in a sense. So before we had money, we needed like a third good that we could trade for. If there was a farmer, for instance, who was harvesting fruit during the summer, during the winter he would not be able to actually trade that for anything, because all of the fruits of his labor, literally, in the winter would have gone off by that point. And so if he needs to trade with a fisherman, for instance, he needs to be able to earn some sort of good during the summer, such that by the time winter comes, he's not going to starve to death. Because if you look at mankind from a bird's eye perspective again, you don't want all of your farmers dying, because food's quite important. And yeah, so that's why we needed money. And Bitcoin is just another solution to the money problem. We've had plenty of forms of money across history. It was cowrie shells for a while, like these little shells from the beach, but that suffered inflation as humans became more effective and were able to find more of them. Then it was probably most notably gold for a large portion of human history. And gold was great because it did a really good job at satisfying the 6 properties of sound money, which is basically just a checklist for money that works and can store your value over time. So Bitcoin was setting out to solve this money problem, just as many other things, forms of money have in the past, but it was doing it differently because it was using computers and the internet. And computers and the internet open up the landscape a hell of a lot, because you, as seen in the previous image of just the photo that looks different, you can get away with a lot more on computers, such as telecommunication from a person in Australia to a person in Britain, like that. And it's interesting to think, before we had Bitcoin, the idea that we could do to money what email did to the postal service was a pretty exciting idea. And so many people tried to create Bitcoin, before Satoshi. So how did we solve this problem? How did we get money to work on a digital standard? It's with blockchain, right? Everybody knows about blockchain. I don't know if you've heard about it. A couple news articles recently saying that it's the future of everything. Well, no, this is technically a blockchain. It's not very interesting. You have the header of the block and the body. In the header of the block it says 0, this is block 1, and it has some information in the body of the block, which is essentially just a file, a text file, which says +9, so it gives some instructions to the reader to enact on the next one. The next one now has 9 in the header, and it has some more information. It says +3. So then this one has 12 in the header, +1, etc. Technically that's a blockchain. It's a chain of blocks which are just lists of information. But it's not very cool. Not very cool, right? I mean, it might work as money here if I was to stand up on this stage all day and the entire monetary system was based on everybody that just exists in this room right now. Because all of you could tell me, oh, if we create some accounts on here and say Daniel Prince +1 and then Paul Morgan Summers +2, and you wanted to put your hand up and say, hey, can I send my +2 to Daniel Prince? I could come and put that on the actual block. Everybody sees it happening at once and there's no problems. Unfortunately, when you're trying to create digital money on the internet, on a global system, you can't do it like this because this is very centralized. The entire blockchain is centralized on my laptop, which is being displayed to all of you at the same time from this screen. This is quite easy to do, but it's not very revolutionary. Because, for instance, if we were to actually try to use this as a sound money standard for the entire world, well, it'd have to be a pretty big room and everyone would have to be spending all of their time looking at this list. So what do you get from this, though? From having all of you in the same room looking at this, there's an unspoken truth in the room that we have reached a state of consensus, which is basically just a term to describe everybody agrees on what they're looking at, because unless there's some crazy optical illusion going on, I'm sure you can all assume you're looking at the exact same information on the screen. To do this in a decentralized manner that doesn't require any sort of force and is completely opt-in is where the real crux of the issue was. And that was the hard part. That was the bit that Bitcoin had to solve. So one of the, I guess you could say one of the hardest things to solve when it comes to having a digital money system like this is you need it to be finite, right? If it was infinite, it would be not valuable because you could just copy and paste it, for instance. Bitcoin is as valuable as it is useful, and it's useful to the degree to which it is secure. Thus, Bitcoin's value comes from its security. This should be relatively intuitive since it's the security of the Bitcoin blockchain that prevents the supply from being inflated, and it's the finite supply that underpins the price. So where does the security come from? If the value of Bitcoin comes from the consensus mechanism, if you could think of, I don't know if anybody has done any investing or played about with stocks, but if you could think of it as if Bitcoin was a company, which is very much not, unlike Ethereum, but we'll get to that. If it was a company, the core value proposition of it would essentially be its consensus mechanism, because that was the really hard problem that we needed to solve. And that's what Satoshi Nakamoto, the inventor of Bitcoin, did eventually solve. I've been saying consensus mechanism a lot. What is that? Essentially, consensus mechanisms are the answer to the following question. Since there's nobody in charge, there's no dweeb like me standing up on a stage with a list of things and everybody's looking at it at the same time. Since there's nobody in charge of the system and it doesn't run on force of any kind, how do we make sure that the system remains consistent and trustworthy? For instance, if one day you had 10 Bitcoins in your wallet and the next day you had 5, you wouldn't be very happy. You need a bit more consistency than that if you want to have money that works. I guess it would be a good question to ask, actually. Do you have any idea how you make people do things without forcing them to? You cheated. Yes, you got to use incentives, right? You give a carrot and a stick. You give them the carrot if you. I don't know if I'm using this. The carrot is the good thing, right? Yeah. Anyway, you give them a carrot if they do the right thing. You give them a stick if they do the wrong thing. Beat them on the ass or something. Even with training dogs, right? If you want to train your dog to sit, incentives, and then they do it. You're not forcing your dog with some big metal contraption that makes the dog sit down. That would be inhumane. So what's the difference between proof of work then and proof of stake? So this is as simple as I could make it. This is how proof of work works. So say you are proposing another addition, if you remember the blockchain we had earlier. If I wanted to add another block to that chain, what's my carrot? My carrot is I get some more Bitcoin out of it, which is good because that's valuable and useful to me. But what's the stick? Well, we'll find out here. So proof of work. I'm coming to the Bitcoin network, created a block, and this is essentially the flow of logic that comes back to me from the Bitcoin network. Did you expend energy to produce this block? If it's no, then Bitcoin is going to ignore me and look at somebody else's prettier block that had more going for it. Yes, I did expend energy. Can you prove it? No, same thing applies. Yes, then is this block valid? If it's not, it still gets disregarded. And if it is, then the Bitcoin network says, I'll propagate your block and you may claim your Bitcoin reward. Relatively simple, but essentially what it's doing here is ensuring that before somebody even goes to produce a block, say miners for instance, they formulate their block and then they put the work into it. The work is just essentially they take all of the contents of the block, as we saw in the previous example of a blockchain, and using the information inside, that produces the block header. And so while they're running their hashing scripts and trying to find the correct header for the block, they're expending a hell of a lot of energy to do that because it's a very complicated problem. Now, if they had done this, yes, okay, say I'm down $5,000 from electricity costs. I can prove it, yes, yes. Is this block valid? What that's essentially asking is, did you put any fraudulent transactions in there? Are you trying to lie, steal, or cheat from the Bitcoin network? And if you're not, then you get your reward. But if you are, if it's not valid, then you're screwed. And all of the work that you put in, the $5,000 you spent on electricity and all the mining hardware in order to produce that, is all wasted resources for you because you're not going to get any reward from it. The reward that you get from it is purely based on your honesty. And so if you're not an honest miner, or you're trying to lie or steal or cheat or deceive the network, then it's just going to be a lot of wasted resources. So this requires energy expenditure in order to get into it. Rewards rule adhesion and just excludes malpractice. Now, if we look at proof of stake, it's a different story. Proof of stake starts off with the question, do you own ETH? Which is interesting, considering that ETH is the product of the consensus mechanism. So that's interesting to know. So it starts off, do you own ETH? No? You cannot help. Thanks. Yes. Have you put more than 32 ETH up for stake? I checked today, that's about $60,000. So have you put up $60,000 to stake? No? You cannot help. Thanks. Yes, I have. Is it from an address that was previously a validator? A validator in Ethereum is kind of like a miner in Bitcoin. It's just somebody that's adding or voting for new blocks to be added to the chain. If it is from one of those addresses, you cannot help. Great. If it's not, then you get onto another question. Does your opinion on the state of the chain align with over 60% of the validators? No, then you're screwed. If it's yes, then you get another question and another question. And these are the two parts that essentially are trying to, this is the stick here. Have you proposed another block for the same slot? So if you're out there just voting for every block to go into every slot, then that's not technically an opinion, that's you just trying to harvest some Ethereum out of the system. So if you're doing that, then they confiscate some of the 60,000 ETH that you put up for stake. So does the block you voted for clash with other blocks you voted for? So are you, again, just saying, yeah, everything goes, just give me the reward? And if you are, then they confiscate some of your ETH, and it goes back to the question, have you put up more than 32 to stake? So this system, you don't have to understand the entirety of it, but based on just this standard flowchart, you win once you get to the bottom of this long line of questioning. Similar to how we had the 3 points for the proof of work, this requires Ethereum wealth rather than requiring energy expenditure. So basically says you've got to be wealthy. It rewards conformity because if you're not agreeing with over 60% of the other validators in the network, they won't even give you the time of day. That's not ideal. And it punishes laziness and deception, which is the stick. If that was a little bit confusing, this bit is basically the summary of what that means. So with proof of work, as we were talking about with the imaginary waterfall earlier, there was an output of it, which was the spinning of the wheel at the bottom, but it wasn't obvious where the input is. So if we run through proof of work and proof of stake and try and figure out where exactly the inputs and outputs are, then I think this is at the crux of the issue with proof of stake and Ethereum, because proof of stake is the value proposition of Ethereum at this point. So with proof of work, it inputs energy. So in order to mine, you need to expend a lot of energy to produce the block hashes. This energy then is underpinning the consensus mechanism. And it's the consensus mechanism that actually produces the chain, the blockchain, and it's from the blockchain that Bitcoin arrives. The chain produces the Bitcoin. This is a direct linear flow, cause and effect, through to the production of Bitcoin. Then the market will just determine the price. As you can see, this is sort of related to everything else. If you input more energy as a society, not just a single person, but if humans are putting more energy into the Bitcoin consensus mechanism, then it's becoming more secure. And by way of it becoming more secure, you can be more confident in the supply being finite, and you can be more confident in its utility. And as we discussed at the beginning, the value of Bitcoin comes from its usefulness. It's valuable to the degree to which it's secure. This makes sense. But now if we look at proof of stake, it's weird. Because you're inputting ETH at the beginning. The Ethereum then is underpinning the consensus mechanism, since that's the stick that you're giving in the... It's both the stick and the carrot in the incentive design, because you're saying the stick is we might punish you by taking some of your Ethereum if you act wrong, but the reward is also you might get some more Ethereum if you act right. The ETH is underpinning this consensus mechanism, and then same with Bitcoin. The consensus mechanism is generating the chain, and Ethereum is a product of the chain. But then Ethereum is also the input to the consensus mechanism. So the logic is circular of the design of the entire thing. And at its core, this is the value proposition of Ethereum, because if you look at any of their marketing, you'll see that they classify themselves as a decentralized application platform. And this is their decentralization. Decentralization, which is what we'll get to now. So based on this, what's the cost of dishonesty in Bitcoin and Ethereum? When it comes to Bitcoin, for your block to be considered by the network, you must have already incurred a large cost, because you don't present your opinion to the Bitcoin mining network or the Bitcoin blockchain without having already done the energy expenditure and produced the actual block. So you already have skin in the game before you even present your work to the chain, in a sense, or to the network. And the only reward associated with that cost that you incurred is only redeemable if the block you mined was not fraudulent or inaccurate, which means that it did not contain any fraudulent or inaccurate statements. And if you'll notice, this is preventative, because if you're going to spend £5,000 baking a cake, you're not going to set out to do that knowing that the cake will be inedible at the end of it. Or if you're going to spend £5,000 to create a business, you're not going to do that if you know that from the jump the business isn't going to be accepted by the market. So in the same way, if you're going to spend £5,000 mining a block, I pulled that number out of my ass, by the way. I don't know how much energy it costs per block these days, but if you're going to do that, then you're not going to put all of that work into a block that you know is dishonest and can be easily verifiable as dishonest or inaccurate by the rest of the chain, because all of that will go to waste. The cost of dishonesty in Ethereum. Some, or all, potentially, of your staked ETH may be slashed, which just means confiscated, after you have broken the rules. So this is punitive. So we're no longer dealing with a forceless system. There is now force. It is, if you do not act like this, then we will punish you by doing this, which is very different to this, which is you can propose a invalid block to the Bitcoin network if you'd like. You can spend all of that time and energy mining a block that is completely useless, and the only person that will actually be negatively affected by that is you and your energy bill. So that's the cost of dishonesty. What's the cost of governance? If you want to purchase some governing share of both Bitcoin and of Ethereum, what's the cost? So with Bitcoin, energy is the fundamentally scarce resource in the world. You know, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch from the beginning of the talk. That's kind of a knock-on effect of the law of conservation of energy, which is that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. And when you live in a world like that, things become scarce, because once energy turns from chemical into heat, for instance, then you've burned all of your wood and you no longer have heat in the house. And so energy is, at its core, the most fundamentally scarce resource that we have. What about ETH? Fiat has zero cost of production for governments, so keep that in mind. ETH is paid for with fiat. Fiat, if you didn't know, is just pounds or dollars or Australian dollars. Any government-issued currency that you usually consider just to be money is what we call fiat money, because it's introduced by fiat, which is essentially a Latin phrase, I think, that means by decree or by force. So with all your fiat currencies, governments can create them whenever they want. Proof of stake is paid for with ETH. If you remember at the beginning, do you own ETH is the first question that's asked to you from the Ethereum network. Proof of work is paid for with energy, which means that Bitcoin is the finite product of a consensus mechanism that is paid for with a finite resource. It's congruent and it makes sense. But because proof of stake is paid for with ETH, and ETH is paid for with fiat, and fiat has zero cost of production for governments, you reach a situation where governments don't have to incur any cost at all to gain complete control over Ethereum. Now the decentralization of Ethereum is becoming questionable, to say the least. Because if governments can go and print all of the money that they need in order to purchase all of the Ethereum and then put it up for stake and completely trash the entire network, they can do that at no cost. Do you know who would pay for that? Us. Because we're the ones that are using the fiat currencies, and when they print a lot of money, it tends to benefit the people that get their hands on it first, and that's never us. So they could essentially rob Joe, but not to pay Bill, just to break Ethereum at their own discretion, essentially. So coming back to the beginning of the talk then, what's the input? The input's ETH. ETH underpins the consensus mechanism. The consensus mechanism generates the chain produces the ETH, and then inputs ETH back into the whole thing, and it becomes one massive logical tautology. It is true by necessity, because it's the product of this entire system, Ethereum, is valuable by necessity, because if it's not valuable, then you don't have a consensus mechanism, and you don't actually have ETH. You just have a lot of code. So that's why Ethereum sucks. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, if it's so full, why is it so popular, and why is everyone talking about it being including the institutions?
Well, this image, I forget the actual name, I just put waterfall.png, but this image is a very famous painting that was done a long time ago. It's interesting, the painting itself is interesting because it's almost promising you something that can't be delivered, right? A perpetual motion machine in which the water just flows down the whole thing, and you look at it and you're like, I can't see the point at which the water's going uphill, because if you look at the bricks, you can see it's clearly going down. It ended up being one of the most popular paintings in history because of this. And Ethereum, if it's doing the same thing, it's promising you a free lunch. and it won't deliver. And when you're being promised a free lunch, then you get a hell of a lot of attention from a lot of people, especially if you can sort of give out bits of scraps here. I mean, it's the sort of basis of all Ponzi schemes is that they have to drip feed their victims with some level of confidence, otherwise the entire thing goes kaput. So they rob Bill to pay Paul, and then they rob Paul to pay Jeff, and then it goes on for a while. So it's easy, I think, at the beginning of scams to get a lot of people very interested, even if the entire thing is just some techie people flying by the seat of their pants that don't know anything about the real world. So yeah, I think, and also it did run on proof of work for a while. It only switched over in September of last year to proof of stake, which, if you've learned anything, you'll know that that's absolutely insane, because that's like Tesla suddenly deciding saying to all of its investors, hey, I know that you think of us as a battery company and not really a car company, because really that's where the innovation of our whole thing comes from, but we're going to stop producing batteries and electric cars. We're going to start making tractors. And we're going to stop everything that we were doing before that. And you go, that's a different company then. I'm no longer invested in Tesla. Tesla's dead, it's something else. That's what Ethereum did to every single user of the network last year. So yeah. Yes?
What would be your opinion on Ethereum if it's still proof of work?
It's still terrible, because even when it was proof of work, it was there was a reason, I think, that they moved to proof of stake. It was described when they were doing it as as like trying to switch out the engine of a 747 mid-flight or something, and so they were clearly nervous about it themselves, to switch it out while keeping the project running. So there's a strong reason for it, and I think in large part they caved into the well, there was a lot of pressure around environmental concerns of proof of work, and so they, as a company and not a technology, they're quite concerned about PR. But even when they were proof of work, they're heavily centralized, because the actual chain itself had to take all of these nuanced design trade-offs that were present in Bitcoin that worked for the purpose of creating money in a newly digital world, and they got rid of all of those nuances and very specific trade-offs and just said, screw it, 8 pictures and complicated contracts that nobody asked for, and you know, we can do backflips and side flips and spin the thing upside down, but it can't really serve its fundamental purpose, which is just to be a decentralized account for value. So it moved to proof of stake because of that. Yeah, I think it was experimental in the early stages, and then got a lot of PR and a lot of hype, which turned it into something bigger than it should have been. And obviously with the cognitive framing bias as well, when everybody looks at Bitcoin, they see something really expensive, even though the actual numerical value on the price of a single Bitcoin is kind of arbitrary. But they still see that and think that, oh, I can't afford a whole Bitcoin, so I'll look for cheaper coins. And I think that partially answers the question earlier as well about why it's become so popular, because people just see it as a way to make more money, and they see it as a cheaper version of Bitcoin. And unless you know any of this stuff, then that's probably the most high-resolution version of the truth that you can come up with at that time. Anyone else? No? I'm selling some books. If anybody wants to buy some, if you've got a Lightning wallet, I'm going to sell some for 10 quid. But other than that, thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Angelo. Yeah, so...